This is They Create Worlds, episode 229, U.S. Gold.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again from the slave mines of America, where Alex and I toil away in the mines getting gold. Because, you know, everyone likes gold.
I thought the gold farmers were Chinese.
No. Why would they be Chinese? Oh, wait. WoW gold. Final Fantasy gold. And all those other MMO gold. It's all them. That's where the true gold is. Okay, so really this isn't about U.S. gold. This should be about, I don't know, hacking gold?
Well, maybe that's a topic for next month. But yes, this month we are going to look across the pond from our perspective, once again to look at the very crucial British publisher U.S. Gold, as well as its parent company, the major distribution company, CentreSoft. Been a while since we've done an episode focused more on the United Kingdom. We're definitely overdue for that, as we do try to take a global perspective as much as possible in the sources we have on the industry, and U.S. Gold is truly one of the titans of the British industry, and even to a lesser degree, the entire European industry. One of the crucial publishers and distributors over there in the 1980s and early 1990s. So, yeah. Good subject for an episode.
Definitely. I know we talked about the British market in the past. We've talked about the computer game markets, everything from the Acorn to the ZX Spectrum. Sir Clive of ZX is an episode that comes to mind about that.
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to look at U.S. Gold specifically to tie into that larger narrative?
Well, they're a key driver of that larger narrative. Really, it's just a matter of tracing the company's history and how it became so important to the British software market as a whole, computer game market specifically as a whole, and really was behind a lot of the trends going on within that market throughout the 1980s.
So how do we start with this? Who do we look at who founded U.S. Gold in Great Britain and then expanded it into arguably one of the largest importers and porters of U.S. games and arcade hits?
Absolutely. So it really does go all back to one individual in this case, and that is an individual by the name of Jeff Brown. Jeff in this case being Geoff, Jeff, rather than Jeffrey Jeff of They Create Worlds. Jeff Brown is a quite interesting fellow. He grew up in a very, very poor part of the city of Birmingham in the Midlands of the United Kingdom of England, an area that in post-World War II was undergoing a lot of decline because this had been the industrial heartland of England and of Great Britain, and that era of industrial might and dominance is rapidly ending. So a lot of poor kids growing up in cities across the Midlands, from Birmingham to Manchester to Liverpool, all along there. Which is also why this is an area that really was where a lot of the British computer game industry ended up being housed. These were economically depressed areas that needed to be on the lookout for new industries. Areas where labor was relatively cheap, where real estate was relatively cheap just because times were so tough, and where you had a lot of disaffected youth who needed something to do, like, say, coding in their bedroom. Not surprising that Jeff Brown is from this neck of the woods. You know, Ocean, of course, was a big Manchester company, for instance, also the Midlands. His first love, however, and his first talent even, was music. From a very young age, from his early teenage years, he was involved in all sorts of R&B and rock and roll outfits around the city of Birmingham. They never quite broke through. He had a couple of groups that a few times got managers They kind of almost made it in the late 1960s, 1967, when they were signed and did some singles in psychedelic rock. But he kind of drifted in and out of this music scene, writing, playing guitar, singing, during this period that he was growing up and going to college. Luckily for him, since the music thing didn't end up working out, though it did get close a couple times, which we'll go into a little more detail on in a second, he did also have technical aptitude, and he was lucky enough, despite being from a very poor area, to attend a technical school in Birmingham for a secondary education. So he got a real solid grounding in math and science as a result of that, was good at it. Then he matriculated to Birmingham University to study math, and so was getting a solid mathematical education while continuing this music thing all throughout college as well. When he graduated from school, he did graduate from university. He went for a couple of years to work for a company called Leland in Britain as a computer programmer. He was introduced to computers very early. This was at the end of the 60s, so of course we're talking mainframe computers. Punched cards and all of that stuff, but he's learning that this kind of stuff exists, even though none of this is going to end up being what gets him into the U.S. Gold thing. It is kind of important that he had an understanding of and a background in computers from very early in his professional career. In fact, it would be the music that ends up getting him into computer games in a very, very roundabout way. Even as he's working at Leland, he's still playing with local bands. He's still trying to break through. And finally, in the middle of the 1970s, he and a group of people that are now doing prog rock got very close to actually having their breakthrough. They were able to cut a couple of EPs. They had a single that was picking up some steam. And in 1977, they were going to appear on Top of the Pops. It's kind of like the American Bandstand in a way of Britain back in the day. Like, if you got on Top of the Pops and got to play on Top of the Pops, everyone watched. This is one of the big ways that you could get discovered in the United Kingdom. Appearing on Top of the Pops was like a golden ticket. Everything was set to go, and Elvis Presley died.
Oh.
So Top of the Pops that week completely turned on a dime, because of course Elvis had been so incredibly popular, and reformatted the show that week to be all about Elvis and playing Elvis music and remembering Elvis. And so they lost their spot on Top of the Pops and never again got so close to the big time. So having kind of been finally thwarted after years of on again, off again, professional, semi-professional playing of various types of rock and roll and R&B music, Brown decided in 1978 to enroll in a teacher's college so that he could become a teacher. He did that in, I think, 1981. He did it for a year and a term, then ended up quitting that because of his epiphany with computer games. As I said earlier, it was through music that this happened, because during this period, he didn't work for Leland very long. I don't know exactly how long, but he wasn't working for Leland in the computer stuff for very many years. Once he started getting back into the music more seriously, he wasn't doing that anymore, but he was working other jobs because, the music wasn't paying the bills. He did spend a lot of time working at various music stores in Birmingham, including one called Woodruff's. In 1977-ish, 77, 78-ish, probably 78, Woodruff's, this music store, started carrying a little thing called the Atari 2600.
Why would a music store carry an Atari 2600?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will give you a straightforward answer that leads to more questions. Well, Jeffrey, it turns out that musical instrument company Selmers was initially the distributor for the Atari 2600 in Great Britain, and they already had reach into music stores. So there you go. That makes sense, right?
What does God need with a starship?
Yes, that begs the next question, which is why the heck is Selmers distributing the Atari 2600? I don't know exactly why. I mean, I don't have the real answer for you, but I think it just has to do with, as much as anything, that video games were something very new, and it wasn't exactly certain where they fit in. Especially in Britain, a lot of weird kind of stores and whatnot were getting into it. If I had to make a guess, I would say that maybe since music stores were already dealing in 8-track cassettes and compact cassettes, that maybe there was a feeling that like, oh, these cartridges and for the computers, these cassette tapes are very similar to the kinds of things we're already demoing. Maybe it's also that music stores tend to have staff that are very hands-on and trained to help customers very closely, and that's something that new things like video games and computers needed. But that's just speculation. I don't know. And obviously, they weren't only being sold in music stores. Yeah, they were being sold other places too. But that may be why music stores were one of the things jumping on the bandwagon. It could even be that in places like Birmingham that were economically depressed, and in Margaret Thatcher's New Britain where technology was being touted, maybe they just saw this as a way to try to ride that wave and get a little extra income. I don't know. But regardless, Jeff Brown was introduced to video games through this store, Woodruff's, that then also started carrying other Atari products. They started carrying the Atari 400 and 800 computer. They carried some software, and they also carried some magazines related to that whole scene. Once the computers came in, Jeff, who had had experience with computers in the past, even if they were hulking mainframes, decided to buy himself one. He originally went with the Atari 400 because it was cheaper, quickly realized it was cheaper because it was useless, and traded that back in for the Atari 800, and got to business, not just playing games, but also learning to program. He actually created a couple of small educational games. Remember, at this point, he's either going to teaching school or become a teacher. I don't know exactly where he was in his journey, but education was definitely on his mind. So he made a couple of very simple educational games, sold them to one of the early outfits, English Software, and made a couple of bucks on that, and thought, well, isn't this neat? Though what really got him from being, I'm tinkering around with this a little bit, to, I'm going to actually found a company to do this, was because he started reading Compute magazine. So Woodruff's, in addition, as I said, to carrying the hardware and the software, they also imported a couple of the U.S. magazines that were devoted to computers. There wasn't much of a scene yet for this in the United Kingdom, so they were relying on the foreign imports. Compute had advertisements for American games, obviously, because it's an American magazine. He came across a Galaxian clone in there called Galactic Chase and was absolutely blown away by it. He could tell that it was just so much better than what was being done on the whole in the United Kingdom at the time, where what little was happening, because we're talking at this point probably 1980, 1981, there was very little happening yet. You know, the Spectrum hadn't hit yet. That market hadn't taken off yet. So there was very little software. It was mostly on more primitive systems like the ZX80 or ZX81. It was all bedroom coders. There weren't really many professional software people in it. Here in the United States is this game that's just, wow, so much better than what anyone's doing here. He had an idea. He was like, I could bring this game over. I'm sure they have no idea about the UK or what's going on in the UK. I could buy this game from them, and then I could sell it over here. So he got a few copies. He called up the company, got a few copies. He went to the local Curry's buyer in Birmingham, Curry's being one of the few retailers in the early days that was starting to get into selling computer games. They were a company in the electronics business that was a chain in the United Kingdom. Went to the Birmingham buyer, showed him the game. The guy thought it looked great and said, yeah, I'll take 100. So he called up Static Software, the company that created it, back in the United States, ordered 100, said he wanted 100 of them. They gave him terms, standard terms, 30 days for payment. Sent him the games, had a moment where it was hard to get them through customs because customs had never seen computer games coming through before and didn't know how to classify them. Finally decided to just call them toys and wash their hands of it. Got the games into the country, got them to Curry's, and they sold out very quickly. He was off to the races. In very late 1982 or perhaps early 1983, somewhere in that time period, he started his own company in the computer game distribution business that at the time he called SoftCell. I think he might have started in 82, but not incorporated it until 1983. He incorporated by buying an off-the-shelf company, something that people do sometimes where some firm goes through all the trouble of setting up a corporation, goes through all the registrations and all of that, with the sole intent of then flipping it around to someone who needs a corporation, so then that person doesn't have to go through all the hassle of setting one up.
So you're saying that I could have done that for They Create Worlds and saved myself a bunch of headache?
I don't think that would have been worth it. And had himself a company that he initially called SoftCell and started focusing on bringing in this U.S. software into the UK and selling it around. The Currys buyer at Birmingham ended up becoming the buyer for the entire chain not too long after, so he was able to sell in product throughout all of Currys, and he was off to the races. As this is going on, of course, the Spectrum market is also starting to take off in the United Kingdom. So after a little bit of time, he also starts expanding into distributing UK product as well. The UK industry is kind of moving out of its mail order phase. Some of the companies in that space, most notably Spectrum Software, which would soon become known as Ocean, we did some episodes on them, were starting to feel their oats and wanting to get involved in more retail distribution. So this company, SoftCell, starts taking on more and more product and starts getting a nice little business going. After not too much time, that runs afoul of a U.S. company, a very famous company in the United States called SoftCell, that is also a software distributor.
Mm-hmm.
They're not happy about this. They say, change your name or we'll sue you. Jeff and his wife, Anne, who is a little more business savvy than him, had experience working at a bank and knew a little bit about how business worked and helped in setting things up in the early years, kind of came back at them and said, yeah, we're in Britain, you're in the United States. Good luck trying to sue us. SoftCell thought about that and was like, okay, fine. How about we give you like £7,000 and you change your name to something else? So they were like, okay, we'll do that. And that's how they changed their name from SoftCell to CentreSoft. In the midst of all of this, Jeff starts taking trips to the United States in order to not just go through magazine ads to see what's going on in the U.S., but just actually go back to the country, visit the country himself, and see things for himself and tour some of the publishers to see what there is to get. He's blown away by some of the offerings that he's seeing. He goes primarily to Access Software, Utah company, which has the game on the Commodore 64 Beachhead. He also goes to Cosme. The owner of that company had been in the tape duplication business for music and had started up a little game thing on the side and had a couple of games that looked interesting. Jeff called Forbidden Forest and Aztec Challenge. By this time, we're moving away from the Atari market that he had started in. The Commodore 64 has come out, and there's a real market for Commodore 64 software. Now, initially, even in the United States, that market was very cassette-based because there were a lot of problems, as you know, Jeffrey, and as we've talked about before, Jeffrey, through the context of your experience with Commodore's 1541 disk drive and the slowness thereof.
You know, being able to start the thing loading, go have dinner, come back to it still loading.
Indeed. So a lot of the early software was available in cassette as well as disk. And of course, the British market was entirely a cassette-based market. That was all fine and good as it went, but he was starting to feel like there was an opportunity when he saw this next round of games to do something more than just be a distributor. Because as a distributor, I mean, what you're doing is you're taking the software that they're making and you're just putting it on shelves. You're entirely just the middleman in the transaction. You have no real identity of your own. I mean, obviously, if you have a lot of lines, then you have advantages when you're negotiating with retail because you can offer them a lot of software. But you don't really have a public identity. The public doesn't really know who the distributors are. Looking at the quality of this software and also looking at the fact that he'll probably want to port it to other computers as well to get even further reach in the United Kingdom where things like the Spectrum are taking off, he decides that he really needs to be more than just a distributor. Not that he's giving up the distribution business, but he feels like he should publish this software under his own name as well. And it was actually the founder of Cosme Corporation, George Johnson, who indirectly gave him the idea for how to handle this because, as I said, he'd been involved in the tape business, the music tape business. We've talked about this in a couple of episodes in other contexts, how in the very early days, the compact cassette market was an ancillary market. The major record labels were far more focused on their records than they were on cassettes, and so they were giving up a lot of rights to other companies that would then release things on compact cassette. Something that Johnson had done is he had created sub-labels in order to peddle various bundles of music that he had gotten the rights to in his tape business. And he had one that he called Gold Hits, that were these compilations of songs on tape. Jeff really loved that idea, and he also already had a general idea of kind of how the record business worked in that way, where you have artists who get fully publicized on their work, but then you also have the record label that is curating those artists, producing those artists, and releasing the work of those artists, and they also get their name on the album cover and also get publicized and have their own identity. So kind of taking that general idea of that, plus this idea of Gold Hits that he's talking to about with George Johnson, he decides that he's going to create a label, a publishing label, that is going to be dedicated to bringing this U.S. software over, and it's going to be consolidated under his label. It'll be under his name. The companies will get their name on the box too, just like an artist would, but it'll all be under him, and he'll advertise heavily in publications, and he will have a logo, and he will make his own title screen. Then he'll also do some porting of some of these games to computers that are in the United Kingdom that aren't in the United States, like the ZX Spectrum. Kind of taking his lead from this Gold Hits thing, decides to call it US Gold. US because it really is in the beginning dedicated to bringing over the software from the United States, and then Gold both because of this thing with George Johnson and also just the idea that gold is valuable, gold records are hits, just the idea that this is top-tier, high-quality software. Because he feels it is such top-tier, high-quality software, he also decides that he's going to charge a premium for it. This is at a period of time when the British market is really at a crossroads, because we're talking 1984 now when he's getting ready to start US Gold. He's started Centresoft before that, but US Gold is 1984. The industry has just been hit by a lot of problems, such as it is. The typical game in this period is kind of a £5 or £6 game. And remember, pound sterling are more valuable than US dollars if you're one of our American listeners. So they cost more than that in US dollars. So that's a pretty decent chunk of change, more than it may sound like to American ears at first blush. There was just a lot of bad software out there. There were a lot of fly-by-night publishers. There were a lot of bedroom coders. Most business was still being done through mail order. You were getting some distribution in shops, but it was hit or miss. And there were just a lot of games coming out, and most of them had a lot of problems with them because there was a lot of fly-by-night stuff going on. This had led to a lot of discouragement amongst consumers, and the consumers in this case are mostly kids, teenagers, who have very little disposable income anyway and can't afford to waste it on losers. So as they're faced with this kind of untenable market, they do what teenagers always do when faced with these kind of untenable markets and start pirating like crazy, especially after cheap double cassette decks start becoming more common starting around 1983, which means that more people have the ability to copy cassettes very easily. And the UK market, as we've said many times, is still at this point very much a cassette-driven market. They have not embraced the floppy disk like the American market has by now. This caused a real crisis in the industry. It caused some of the bigger names in the business to have financial difficulty. It also drove a new business model pioneered by Mastertronic primarily into budget software, which is, let's make these games so cheap that no one's going to bother pirating them. Let's sell them for £2, but then let's flood the market. The only way this works is we have to release a lot of games, and we have to get them into every location imaginable to make that profitable. The whole market is kind of being dragged down into budget software by this whole piracy problem. Now you have US Gold coming in and saying, not only are we not going the budget route, but we are going to charge almost double. We're going to charge £9.95 for our games instead of £5 or £6. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement to make. But, they have these American games. They have Beachhead, they have Forbidden Forest and Aztec Challenge. He goes to Datasoft and gets Bruce Lee, and he gets Zaxxon because Datasoft has the home computer rights to the arcade classic Zaxxon. He's got some pretty impressive games, Zaxxon and Beachhead especially, that he can kind of hang his hat on here. He also advertises very heavily in the game magazines of the time in order to start really building up the US Gold brand and developing this reputation, which is what allows him to get away with this. And so US Gold is a hit pretty much right off the bat, particularly Beachhead. He very quickly gets some of the big names in the United States signed up, some of the ones I already mentioned, some of which are bigger than others, but then also he gets micropros very early as well. Yeah, that's kind of how his 1984 goes, which is pretty darn good. He's kind of establishing a higher price in opposition to this kind of budget model that's taking over, and is finding a place for these higher quality, higher priced games in the British market. Of course, they start out on C64 because he's importing from the US, and that's where the original games are on, but he does start paying for ports, having development houses port to other systems as well. Most of that early work is done by his early partner in crime, which we also have to mention at this point, Ocean Software. We don't have to talk a lot about Ocean Software here because we've already done episodes on them. Those episodes still hold up. You can look for them there. But suffice it to say that John Woods and David Ward at Ocean also have big dreams, and they've also been resisting the push into budget games. Their claim to fame in these early days are knockoffs of popular arcade games at the time, but they've expanded out of mail order and into retail. They're doing pretty well with some of their games, and they are absolutely not trying to go to the lowest common denominator on price either. Some would argue that in this time period they were going to the lowest common denominator on quality, but that is an entirely different argument. Centresoft, Jeff's distributor, had a very close relationship with Ocean because they're distributing their product. It's very expensive for Jeff Brown to get some of these games out of the United States. There's a lot of money he has to put up front because he needs to guarantee a certain level of sales to these U.S. publishers to make it worth their time to do the deal. The U.S. publishers, they're not entering the U.K. market. They know nothing about the U.K. market. They're not concerned. They don't want to know about the U.K. market. But they still want to make sure that it is truly worth their time to be doing these deals. And so there's normally a minimum guarantee that Jeff has to promise in order to get the licenses to these software. Then, in order to secure that guarantee, he needs to provide a letter of credit that basically says, you will get paid no matter what happens for this guarantee that I gave you. That is secured by a bank, and there has to be money down for that, and it's all business stuff. But the point is, there's money that he needs to put in up front in order to license all of these games that he's very confident he's going to recoup on the back end because he feels everything's going to sell through, and he was proven right in that. But he still has to make it to when that stuff sells through. He needed some investment to really ramp this operation up. So enter Ocean Software.
So really what he's doing is he's going to the publishers and saying, hey, I will guarantee you 100,000 sales of this game. Here's the money up front, whether or not it does that. If it goes over 100,000, you get 100,000 plus the bonus. But at the very least, I guarantee you 100,000 sales. And I'm going to pony up the money for it. Here's the letter of credit that says, hey, I already set this money aside specifically for you.
Mm-hmm.
So if I go bankrupt, you have a stronger case for getting money. Please, please, please let me take your wonderful game from the United States and bring it to Britain.
Exactly, because you get the letter of credit from the bank. So basically the bank is securing this deal, essentially. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. And so he needs money up front to be able to set up all of these deals because he's trying to lock up as many of these American companies as he can. So he goes to Ocean, which is one of his really big customers, and says, I'm doing this US Gold thing. There's a lot of great software I'm bringing in. I'm going to make so much money on this. I just need some investment up front. He asked them to invest £50,000 in US Gold in return for 50% of the company.
That's really risky. You're giving up probably majority control of a company and putting a lot of faith into it.
I mean, you're right in general terms, but it's not that risky because this is the side business. The main business is the distributor, and Ocean, being one of his customers, has a vested interest in Centresoft continuing to be successful. It's almost scandalous. They're making a deal with one of their largest customers to finance the acquisition of additional software to funnel through the same distributor that is going to be competing with them, but is also going to be opening up the market even wider and providing Centresoft more clout to get all of its titles into stores, including Ocean's own software. It's kind of bonkers, really. They're almost setting up a cartel.
Yeah, I think I can understand where you're coming at here. It's like me going to someone and saying, "Oh, hello, Italian restaurant. I'm the distributor that dispenses noodles. So that we can have more noodles in the market, I need you to invest money in me. Not only will people who buy Italian restaurant noodles, there's also going to be Chinese noodles, there'll be Japanese noodles, there'll be all the noodles. Noodles for everyone. It's going to be great. By me being able to get all the noodles everywhere, eventually we're going to raise the thing so that Italian noodles for Italian restaurants go everywhere." I don't know. Maybe this analogy works. I'm floundering here a bit.
I'm not sure either, but I think you're mostly on the right path. US Gold is going to be a competitor of Ocean, but the success of US Gold will also increase the success of Centresoft. And if Centresoft's success increases, then the companies that distribute through Centresoft will also see greater success coming out of that because Centresoft will have more clout with retailers. So that benefits Ocean in the end as well because they're going to get a bigger market for their games, and they're also going to have inside information on one of their top competitors and what one of their top competitors is doing so that these two companies can maybe not release the same kinds of games at the exact same time. Or if one of them's strong in this market, the other one goes to be strong in that market instead. It's kind of a cartel situation, quite frankly. I mean, you know, a drug cartel is probably an even better example of what is going on here, where you have a single distributor that's pulling in a lot of supply from all over the place and joining everyone together so that everyone makes more money than they could separately. So it's kind of a bonkers situation to have Ocean having 50% of the company. And then, of course, on the other side of that, as I said, Jeff Brown wants to convert some of these games to British computers as well, like the ZX Spectrum. So in the beginning, not through the entire history of US Gold, but in the beginning, the company he turns to do that porting to the Spectrum is none other than Spectrum powerhouse Ocean Software, which then fobs it off to Platinum, which was one of their developers that they work with. So Ocean even benefited directly from this by being the company that did the early ports of some of these games, like Beachhead to the Spectrum, through their own contract developers. Just a really gnarly situation when you think about it. They also took advantage of this for advertising as well, because they pooled together on their ad purchases in the magazine. So they might buy 80 pages in a magazine over the course of like 6 months, let's say. I mean, I'm just throwing random numbers out there. They would go in together and buy 80 pages together and therefore get a massive bulk discount because they're buying so many pages. Now, Ocean didn't need 80 pages. US Gold didn't need 80 pages. But they could each divvy that up between them and decide who would take which pages in which month. So they had a huge advantage over their competitors. They were able to do so much more advertising than their competitors could because they were buying so much more than they needed at a steep discount and then divvying it up with their good friends at Ocean.
That is pretty gnarly. It sounds illegal, but I guess technically it's not.
No, I mean, it's not hidden. It's all above board. You know, it may be that technically Ocean may not have had a stake in US Gold. It was probably technically Woods and Ward had the share in US Gold. I don't know how all the legalities work. I mean, everyone knew they were doing it. It's not like they were hiding it. They're closely held companies, so they don't have a lot of duties. There's not a lot of regulation that they have to pay attention to because they're not public companies. Yeah, it's a real interesting situation, and it leaves the Ocean folks with a huge stake in the company. then them doing these kind of economies of scale together in an almost cartel-like fashion for a few years. That's kind of 1984 and into 1985. He has a very good year in 1984. And in 1985, expands the company a little bit. And the main thing he does is he brings in a new sales guy who eventually becomes the managing director of the company by the name of Tim Chaney. Next to Jeff Brown, Chaney is probably the most important person in the rise of the company because he was just an absolutely unbelievable salesperson. He had joined Commodore in 1982, the UK branch. Commodore was very strong in the UK. His specialty there at Commodore, in his own words, this is his own words, I'm not saying anything that he has not said himself. His specialty was stiffing.
Stiffing.
What stiffing is you basically find yourself a mark to take more software than they actually need so that you can make lots and lots of sales. Yeah, he was very good at stiffing companies. In fact, he managed to stiff Centresoft. When Jeff Brown was sniffing around for software, he came to Commodore and was like, what's out there, what's good? And he's like, oh, Jeff, my boy, I've got all the good software. Here, you should have one of these and one of these and one of these. And it was all the software that he hadn't been able to move for months and were absolute losers. But Jeff was a novice in the market and didn't know that. So he ended up getting stiffed. This impressed Jeff and Ann Brown, and we remember being his wife who's looking over more of the business side of things. So they take Tim out to dinner and are like, you stiffed us. Now we'd like you to stiff everyone else for us.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Something like that. And so they brought Chaney on in sales, eventually becomes managing director. They are really able to start expanding their distribution. You know, Centresoft is a player, but there are other players as well. There's no traditional software distributors because there was no retail distribution of software before all of this was going on. So a lot of the other distributors were in other fields. There was a book distributor by the name of Webster's, not related to the dictionary, but their name was Webster's, that had taken on software. One of the retailers that Webster's was selling into was a bookseller called John Menzies. Webster not really understanding the software market because, books, there are hot books, there are best-selling books, there are new books that come out that you have to make sure everyone has, but older books also still sell. Pride and Prejudice doesn't necessarily sell that many copies a year anymore, though who knows, maybe it does. But bookstores still stock it. Like, you can still sell copies of Pride and Prejudice today, even though that book is from the 19th century. Computer games have a shelf life. You can't just be like, I have a game that came out 2 years ago, you should take more copies of it. That just does not work in this space, and Webster's didn't really understand that, and so they were having difficulty, and John Menzies was having difficulty with the software that they were getting from Webster's, being able to move it, and so Chaney and Brown courted John Menzies very hard and came away with the distribution for the company. Then, several months after that, an even bigger fish, Boots, comes a-knocking. Boots is a chemist's chain, drugstore in United States parlance. They've been involved in the computer game industry since very early on. They've also been working with Webster's, and Webster's completely drops the ball with them and can't fulfill their orders, and they turn to Centresoft and are like, I think Tim Chaney knew someone there, turns to Centresoft and says, Webster screwed us in our order. We need software. Can you provide it? So, of course, Chaney and Brown said yes, and so they got themselves into Boots. They had a contract with John Menzies that said they couldn't deal with any other big national chains, but they just gave John Menzies a discount, an additional 2.5% discount, and they were satisfied. They're like, fine, whatever, we don't care. So then they were in Boots as well. So they're getting this huge reach for their software. During this period, they're also getting more companies. They lose Microprose. Microprose was one of the first companies they got, as Wild Bill Steely likes to tell, and how he's told me and others, the co-founder of Microprose. Now, he did the deal with this guy in the UK, and then he came over to visit in the UK and saw that his guy, I assume Jeff Brown, but I don't know for certain, that his agent there was driving a Porsche. In Wild Bill Steely's words, I wasn't driving a Porsche. That means that they're making way too much money here on my stuff, and I can make a lot of money here on my stuff. So he pulled Microprose out and started selling Microprose in the UK directly. He founded his own UK subsidiary. But even though they lost that, they got a lot of other companies. They got Epix, which was a big get. They got SSI, which was an okay get. Eventually, they even get Lucasfilm Games as well. So they're getting some of the really big and interesting names in the US. They're not getting everybody, but they're getting some of the really interesting companies and continuing to grow in the market. In 1986, they even start expanding into other European countries. They open sales offices all across continental Europe, continental Western Europe, so that they're starting to become a major distributor in those markets as well. The Centresoft distribution business is going great. The US Gold business is going great. Then a little company called Elite Systems changes everything. We've also done an episode on Elite. So if you want the full details on that, I suggest you go listen to that episode. But basically, Elite Systems came up with the idea of securing hot arcade licenses from Japan for release in the United Kingdom. In late 1985, they released a port of Commando, the classic Capcom run and gun, for computers, and had the #1 game during the Christmas selling season in the United Kingdom with their Commando port. This completely took the US Gold people off guard. They were so focused on bringing over this US software, it had never even occurred to them to try to go to Japan and secure hot arcade properties and sell those, create ports and sell those into the UK market. They were basically immediately like, oh no, we can't let this tiny little company above a fish and chips shop in Walsall, as Cheney himself put it in interviews, get one over on us and have a #1 game because they went to Japan. We can go to Japan too. So they shifted their focus, not entirely, because they still kept bringing over software from SSI and Epix and Lucasfilm Games and all of these other companies. But they shifted a huge amount of their focus to going to Japan and locking up relationships with these arcade game companies. They also went to Atari as well. Even though they were focused on Japan, they locked up Atari games. They went to a company called the International Development Group, IDG, that had been founded by the former Atari International president, Anton Bruhl, who served as kind of an advisor to and an agent for companies that were interested in the video game business. Worked with an agent there with the rather quixotic name of Manlio Allegra to make connections with Atari and with companies in Japan like Capcom and SEGA to make sure that they would have some of the hottest arcade licenses. Those were their three closest relationships. I mean, they got some games from other places as well, but they released Gauntlet, for example, from Atari, which was a big hit. They released Street Fighter from Capcom, and especially important, they had the rights to Outrun by SEGA, which was a huge arcade hit and became a huge hit in the home when US Gold released it in 1987. Because, these arcade games were hugely popular in the United Kingdom. We've talked about this before, but there was a culture in the United Kingdom of families going away on a holiday to the coast of the United Kingdom, places like Blackpool and Brighton, going and hanging out at the beach, and there would be arcades at all of these beaches. So while there were also arcades in other places and coin-op games in other places in the United Kingdom, they were especially prevalent in these seaside locales. All the kids would go off on a holiday there with their parents in the summer and then hang out in those arcades and play all of those games. The arcade games were very popular in the 1980s, and now you had companies like US Gold bringing them into the home and completely transformed the British computer game scene, which we talked about in our Elite Systems episode. Once again, we got our little cartel thing going on here because Ocean and US Gold basically decided to divide the market between them. They did not go after the same companies for the licenses. Ocean became close with Taito. US Gold didn't bid on any games from Taito. once again, these two titans of the industry are working to try to squeeze everyone else out, and they're being careful to not bid against themselves, but also to be able to put their full financial resources into the games from the specific companies they wanted. Ocean was very Taito and Nintendo. US Gold was very Capcom and Sega. They squeezed the smaller guys out. We talked about this in the Elite Systems episode. After a couple of years, when everyone else realized what was going on, they really couldn't compete anymore. Because not only did you have two titans in the UK business going after this market in Ocean and US Gold, but they were also essentially colluding with each other and working together to dominate the arcade conversion market in the same way that they had worked together to dominate advertising in the magazines. It's good business, but it's also it's a little shady. I gotta say, Jeffrey,
a de facto duopoly.
Yeah, and there were other companies. Obviously, they were also successful in the UK at this time, and they didn't quite get every big license between them. I mean, there were some coin-op licenses that slipped to other companies, but yeah, they're really working very closely together to dominate the market. They're using their publishing power and they're using Centresoft's distribution power to really kind of corner the market. And so, of course, the 1980s are just an absolutely fantastically successful time for Jeff Brown and US Gold. I mean, they're making money hand over fist. They've got so many of the hot licenses. Their distribution operation is very widespread. They're taking Europe by storm as well. They're the agents for so many of these American companies. They start formalizing development a little more before the end of the decade. They hire Charles Cecil from Arctic Software, and who will later found Revolution Software. They hire Charles Cecil and set up a proper development operation for the first time in the late 1980s. 1988, I think, 87, 88. They still don't have in-house development, but for the first time, they have someone acting as a producer who's really coordinating with all of these companies that they're working with. They're working with smaller European, UK developers like Probe Software, Tiertex, etc., to do these ports and conversions and all of that. Yeah, it's a pretty good time for the company between kind of 1984 and 1991. But then things do start to shift just a little bit because the market is changing. You'd had your 8-bit computers, your ZX Spectrum, your C64, etc. In the UK, there had been a transition from that in the middle of the 1980s to the Atari ST, the Commodore Amiga, the 16-bit set. That transition was fine for US Gold. They're just porting things to all sorts of platforms anyway. They've got a developer staple that they can lean on. Now at the beginning of the 90s, that computer market is starting to dry up a little bit, and console is starting to come in Europe in a big way for the first time. SEGA is the company that's going to end up being kind of more dominant in the United Kingdom, but Nintendo is also a very key player. In the 1980s, Nintendo completely ignored Europe. They were so focused on making money in the United States that they didn't really care about Europe. Now, the NES was sold in Europe, but they went through local companies in order to sell in various places. They weren't taking much of a direct interest in what was going on.
So instead of like making a Nintendo of Europe or something, they just said, oh, you want to carry a NES? Here you go.
Yeah, they worked through, other companies primarily. As they came under more antitrust scrutiny in the United States at the end of the 1980s, they were worried that they were going to start losing ground in the United States, weren't going to make as much money there, and so they started more proactively investing in Europe. They founded a Nintendo Europe. They'd had a UK outfit before that, but they founded an actual Nintendo Europe office, started taking back control in Europe, and started focusing more on that market. Sega had been a little more focused on the market earlier than Nintendo because, of course, they were struggling in the United States. They were struggling in Japan, so they were looking for any market they could get in on. So they'd had a little bit of success in the late 1980s, but they had also been going through intermediaries. They'd been going through Mastertronic and initially a couple of other companies, but Mastertronic kind of ended up with everything across Western Europe. Now, Sega is paying more attention here as well because they're releasing their new 16-bit system, and they feel like the time is nigh to start trying to gain some ground. So consoles start penetrating more and more in Europe at the beginning of the 1990s when they'd been mostly non-existent before that. There really isn't another computer platform coming along to replace the Amiga and the ST. I mean, yeah, of course, there's IBM PCs, but the 8 and 16-bit computers, as we've talked about before in Britain, they were really taking on the same role in a lot of ways the consoles were in the United States. There were a lot more games aimed at children. There were a lot more fast action games. You know, there were platformers and shooters and all of this, where a lot of the U.S. computer game market was based around more high-concept, more cerebral games that cater to an older audience. Those computers, as platforms targeting children and teenagers, were fading away at this point, and the console was filling that void. So it was very clear that they were going to have to get in on console. They couldn't just be in computer games. Of course, they still had all of their deals. They were still doing that. But they couldn't just be on computers anymore. They had to be on consoles. Being on consoles meant that you had to put out a lot more money, because these are cartridge-based systems. We've talked about this before. With cartridges are not only much more expensive than discs or cassettes, but you also have to place a huge order up front for 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, however many cartridges. There's a 3-month lead time to manufacture, so you kind of have to guess what your demand is going to be and place an order right up front for the entirety of demand, because there won't be enough time. By the time you realize you've ordered too few and you want to reorder, it's too late, because it'll be another 3 months and you'll miss your market. You have to put a lot more money up front, and it's a lot more of a risk to be in cartridges than it is to be in cassettes or floppies on computers. So once again, they were going to need a whole new outlay of capital to really be successful in this market. And they were also going to have to look to new markets as well. They were thinking we may have to look even towards getting involved in the United States. I think by the beginning of the 90s, they realized that the time is nigh that they are going to have to go public.
Always a dangerous time going public. It makes you or it breaks you.
Indeed. But there's a few things that they have to do before they can. For one thing, there's this little matter that one of their biggest competitors/customers owns about 50% of the company. That's not going to look so good to the markets. It was a little shady, but mostly fine when they were just private, closely held companies, because nobody is paying too much attention. But the city is not going to like this kind of tie-up where the distributor is 50% owned by its largest customer, who is also one of its largest competitors because of its subsidiary US Gold. That's no good. So in 1991, they do buy out Woods and Ward so that Ocean no longer has a stake in the company. Another thing that they need to do is they need to consolidate a little bit, because he has all of these separate ventures. He has Centresoft, he has US Gold, he has a couple of other small things going on as well. They're all corporations that he bought off the shelf and then turned to his needs. So he's got all of these little corporations running around. He needs to consolidate them all under a single entity for the sake of the city and for the sake of investors. He takes one of his more obscure off-the-shelf companies that he bought, puts his other companies under this company, and names that company CentreGold, which becomes the new parent of all of this stuff, Centresoft and US Gold distribution and publishing and all of this. However, that CentreGold company, he had it before. It was this off-the-shelf company. It just wasn't doing much, but it was the principal investor in another competitor, Gremlin Graphics, which had been started up by Ian Stewart, who owned a computer shop in Sheffield and decided that he wanted to make games, and so decided that he was going to create a computer game developer and publisher. Jeff Brown helped fund him to get started. Another company that is technically a competitor to US Gold, but then also used Centresoft distribution. They're not as powerful a company as Ocean, but it's another company in this web of Jeff Brown-connected firms. The company that is renamed CentreGold is actually the company that owns a large stake in Gremlin Graphics. So he also has to divest CentreGold of Gremlin. He basically gives CentreGold's share back to Ian Stewart at cost. He makes him pay money. He doesn't give it to him for $1, but it's literally just, the amount of money put in, gives it to him at cost, not trying to make a profit on the sale. So it was a good deal for Ian Stewart. He consolidates, he gets out of these strange side deals that he has, and finally in 1993, the company goes public. CentreGold goes public. The first British computer game house to go public. He does so they can enter the cartridge market, so they can start developing some of their own unique product based on licenses, primarily the Olympics. They get rights to some Olympic stuff, and the World Cup. They get some World Cup rights, so they can enter the U.S. market, which I imagine they felt was important since that's such a big consumer of cartridge-based software that they figure if they're having to get in the cartridge business, they don't want to just be beholden to the European and UK markets. They want to be able to enter that U.S. market as well. So they do that. I mean, their public offering is very successful. They're oversubscribed in 93. They make lots of money on the IPO. They set up a U.S. operation. They have a hit game that they convert to console called Flashback. It's a French game from Delphine Software. It's a platforming game that uses rotoscoping style animation, very similar in that respect to Prince of Persia and another French game, Another World. It was very well regarded, very successful. They converted to console, and they have a hit with it in the United States as well as in Europe. Initially, everything is looking great for this new venture that they're doing. But remember the time frame we're talking about, 93, 94, that time period. This is the time period that we did a little episode on called The Crash That Almost Was.
Oh, yeah. But there was no crash. It just kind of almost happened.
Right, because there was a glut of 16-bit cartridge software in the market. So US Gold is a newcomer in this market. Flashback does well, but in general, they don't have a lot of top-tier, well-established product. They've got a couple of licenses. I think they do a Hulk game. Like I said, they have some World Cup stuff. They have some Olympic stuff on the sports side. But these are not very strong licenses, and they're a new company in this space, so they don't have the same clout in this cartridge space, particularly in the United States, that they're used to enjoying in the computer game space, where Centresoft, CentreGold, is the major distributor in the United Kingdom. Overall, this venture into the United States and into cartridge product does not go particularly well. Like, they're not suddenly losing their shirts or anything, but they're definitely not having the success that they're used to.
It's not a runaway success. It's more of a you're barely treading water success.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. business was even worse than that. I think the U.S. business was basically just not great at all, because that market was oversaturated and everyone was kind of waiting for the 32-bit market, for the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn to start. In the United Kingdom, we talked about this in the case of Elite Systems in that episode. The United Kingdom, things were kind of in a bad space as well because the current market was like completely stalling out. Europe was in a recessionary mode and the market's oversaturated and everyone's kind of waiting for this new stuff that's coming. And so the market is kind of in a hiccup here, which isn't great for CentreGold and isn't great for Jeff Brown, who himself admits that the skills required to run a public company are very different from the skills required to run a private company, and he was not necessarily equipped to be the head of a public company. Tim Chaney's gone by this point. He left back in 1989. In 1991, he ends up going to Virgin Interactive. That's not where he left initially, but he ends up going there in 91. And he promptly steals LucasArts, Lucasfilm Games, away from US Gold. So they lose one of their key American partners. They still have most of their others, but they do lose that one key American partner. They're not really in a good position to prepare for this next generation market. So in December 1994, they make a very fateful purchase of a little developer called Core Design. Core Design was a spin-off of Gremlin Graphics, which, as we said previously, Jeff Brown had a relationship with because he had basically funded the beginning of Gremlin Graphics. But Core Design had spun off to be its own thing. Core Design was a struggling developer. It was a small developer, and it was kind of struggling, but they were very much at the forefront of the latest developments in the industry. They were very close with Sega, and they had pushed onto the Mega CD aggressively. They had pushed onto the 32X aggressively. Obviously, those platforms had failed, So it wasn't necessarily great for them financially that they had pushed so hard on those platforms, but it meant that they were one of the chosen few that was also very early with knowledge of the Saturn and was creating Saturn product. Particularly, they were creating, at this time, a little game that would become Tomb Raider. US Gold bought Core Design because they had this in on the latest technology and because they had this in on the next generation, and they were hoping that that could propel them into this next generation of consoles, the 32-bit era that everyone was waiting for. Now, US Gold didn't make it that far. CentreGold didn't make it that far. Because things were a little iffy and because Jeff Brown wasn't really keen on running this thing anymore, in 1996, they end up selling to a little video compression company dreaming of bigger things called IDOS. We talk about this, of course, in our IDOS episode, so you can look for more detail there on that. So in 1996, this whole thing, CentreGold, one of the largest, if not the largest, computer game distributors in the United Kingdom, and also more and more a company involved in the development and publishing of game software, becomes part of the core of the new IDOS apparatus, including Tomb Raider, because CentreGold had bought Core Design. Jeff Brown, according to his own words, who knows if he's just self-aggrandizing, but Jeff Brown likes to take a lot of credit for making sure that IDOS knew what an important thing was going on with Tomb Raider and that they should really keep an eye on an advanced Tomb Raider. I think Ian Livingstone at IDOS also has said that he recognized right away that this was a surefire thing, so I don't know that they needed Brown telling them that. But basically, CentreGold becomes part of IDOS and is the whole reason that IDOS has Tomb Raider, which, of course, launches that company on its own wild roller coaster ride through the industry. Jeff doesn't stay around too long for that. Now that he's sold the company, he gets out pretty quickly, I think in 1997. From then on, it's not the story of CentreGold anymore. It's the story of the IDOS group. And if you want more information on what happens with all that wacky stuff down the line, well, that's a whole nother episode that you can listen to that we did a few years back.
So really, this is a prequel to IDOS.
I mean, that's unfair because it's part of the backstory of IDOS for sure. But Centresoft and US Gold were incredibly successful in their time. Not internationally, the way IDOS would be with Tomb Raider, obviously. It was more, well, I mean, it was international, but not outside of Europe as IDOS would be with Tomb Raider. So, I mean, that cheapens it a little bit to say that it's all prologue for IDOS because it's not. But it is a company that really shows the way the whole market kind of developed. They started in a period of crossroads where it was uncertain whether the market was just going to collapse into budget software or not, and they helped keep the high end of the market going by bringing in US releases. They were one of the companies that pivoted immediately to the arcade game licenses that would dominate a lot of the late 1980s in the United Kingdom after watching what Elite Systems did. They pivoted to cartridges when Sega and Nintendo were starting to make inroads in Europe. And just like the rest of the British industry, just like Elite, which we talk about in that episode, just like Ocean, which we talk about in that episode, they got caught up in that really, really ugly transition from the European perspective from the 16-bit computers and 16-bit consoles to the 32-bit consoles that really flattened a lot of the UK publishing space, then end up selling to IDOS, but also giving them the game that makes IDOS what it is in Tomb Raider, which was already under development at their subsidiary Core Design.
Make you wonder what would happen if they were able to release Tomb Raider and not be a public company that got bought out.
They didn't buy Core Design until after they were a public company. I don't know that they would have bought Core Design if they hadn't been a public company, but it is interesting to wonder if Jeff Brown had brought in some professional management instead of trying to continue running the thing himself after he went public. Be real interesting because, if they had held out just a little bit longer as an independent company, they would have had Tomb Raider and they would have had all of those riches instead of IDOS. That is interesting to wonder about for sure. But, Jeff knew they had something in Tomb Raider. I mean, at least to hear him tell it, he knew they had something in Tomb Raider. But he kind of also knew that he was done. He was just done with this thing. He didn't want to be running a public company. He wasn't good at running a public company. with the market being so uncertain as it was, that the easiest thing to do at that point was just to cash out, which is what he did by selling to IDOS. So yeah.
Quite an interesting story of sort of a rise, growth, and gives a lot more context to how US Gold and Centersoft and everything else sort of ties together and brings in all these different aspects of the British market, and then really solidifies that as a core part of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of surprised it's ending so early.
Well, that happens sometimes. I mean, I could have gone into more depth on some things. There's a whole book that's been written about US Gold that's very good, that had participation. But, I think part of the reason that a couple of these British companies that we've done go so much faster is just because even though their stories are fascinating and amazing and we have good sources on them, we don't have to spend as much time talking about the games because they're doing a lot of licenses and conversions. We don't have to talk about US Gold games in a US Gold episode because US Gold games they're Zaxxon, they're Beachhead, they're Outrun, they're LucasArts adventure games. We talk about the business structures, but we don't have games to go into because they have very little of their own original product, and their own original product, the Olympic and soccer games they did, is not particularly exciting. I mean, they're just kind of throwaway licenses as well. So we're left just talking about the business side and not talking about games so much. But it's a business that really defined and dominated the British market, especially in the way that they worked with Ocean rather directly to be the two top dogs in that market and kind of sustain an ecosystem underneath them. There were only a very small number of publishers in the United Kingdom that reached any size. None of them were as big as publishers in the United States or Japan, but there were only a few that reached any size at all. They did support a massive ecosystem and infrastructure of contract development houses. A vibrant developer scene, but a kind of small publisher scene. And I think talking about US Gold here and how they relate to Ocean really kind of helps explain why that kind of system developed because of the amount of control they were able to exert in that way.
Who knew we had to talk about a cartel or a duopoly on They Create Worlds, but I know we got to have first somewhere.
Absolutely.
As we continue our criminal enterprises, what shall we acquire next in knowledge on They Create Worlds?
Well, I said gold farmers may come back up again at the top of the episode in China, Jeffrey. I think they will indirectly. Not that we'll spend a lot of time on them, because I think it's time for us to all take a journey to the world of Warcraft.
Alex, we did that.
I mean, yes, Jeffrey. Of course we have talked about World of Warcraft. As I say oftentimes in this part of the episode anymore, we've done so many of these episodes, it's almost impossible to not return to a subject that we haven't talked about at least a little bit in some way, shape, or form. We talked about World of Warcraft in the context of Blizzard history in one of our Blizzard history episodes, but that was a long time ago, way back in 2017. The game still exists. There's been a lot more World of Warcraft that's happened since then. There's also the recent book on Blizzard history that Jason Schreier did that provides more insight. And, of course, when we spend a whole episode on a topic, we can go in more depth on that topic than when it's just part of a larger topic, as that one was. So there's definitely been a call amongst our listeners to try to get a little bit more recent content in from time to time when we can. I share our listeners' desire to do that. As I've said in other episodes, the reason we don't do a lot of more recent stuff is because it is hard to have enough info to get the proper context to be able to do that work, just because the sources aren't necessarily all available yet to give it the proper context. But we're definitely at the point that some of the stuff that happened in the early 2000s has a little more context behind it now. World of Warcraft, still going 20 years later, but it is an early 2000s thing to start. There's some good sources out there, some of which were available the last time we discussed it, some of which weren't. So I think the time is ripe to give the people some of that early 2000s love that they want and do a little World of Warcraft.
I guess we just need to figure out whether or not we're rolling Alliance or Horde. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworld. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use, and even the podcasting services you don't use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Back to Your Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.